Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to today's session about politics and identity. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mr. Shahrun Mukan, to open the session. Mr. Shahrun Mukan, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone in Jakarta and all the technical team for pulling all of this together. This is transcontinental. And so our session, we have 3 speakers. I'm the last speaker, substituting for my 2 co-authors, Elliot Ash and Dani Roderick. But prior to that, we have major highlights. Moses precedes me, and the person who's starting off the session is none other than Torsten Persson, who has done lots of foundational work on political economy, and he'll be talking to us about the populist right in Sweden. Thanks so much, Torsten. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shahrun. So it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. So this is a paper which has 2 author teams, one in California and one in Sweden. And as Shahrun said, it's about Sweden's populist radical right. Now, arguably, the rise of the populist radical right is the most important political event since the breakdown of communism. And populist radical right politicians have entered across countries and electoral systems. They are numerous in Europe. They have been ruling in many of Europe's and other parts of the world. They are resurging in Australia, Israel, Japan. It's just a very pervasive phenomenon. Most of these parties have common platforms. In 2 senses, they tend to be anti-establishment. That's what the label populist tend to stand for. And they tend to be anti-immigrant. So that's what the label radical right in practice stands for. And I'm going to present you a case study of the Sweden Democrats. What I'll do is to describe the party's politicians and voters relying on unique data. So this paper is more novel in the sense that it describes individual politicians, who they are, their background. Very few such studies exist, whereas there are many, literally thousands of earlier studies of populist radical right voters. So what kind of animal is the Sweden Democrats? Here I show how the party grew over time. These are the elections for which we have data. And you can see its size doubling in terms of vote share in the left diagram from 2006 to 2010, and then doubling again in 2014 election. Sweden has a proportional representation, so the number of seats that it commanded increases proportionately. Now, currently it's running in the polls at around 18%, and in the last election they got 17%. Now, it's certainly an anti-establishment and an anti-immigrant party. So to illustrate that, I here plot the attitudes of the politicians and the voters of the party. The politicians' views are based on a survey to the universe of local politicians in Sweden that we conducted in 2017. And voter attitudes are based on a survey where we post verbatim the same question to a representative sample of voters nationwide. And as you can see, the Sweden Democrats single out by 90% of its politicians being severely opposed to immigration, more immigration, and 80% of its voters. And all the other 7 parties are clustered towards the origin with much lower shares of politicians and voters that oppose immigration. As a measure of anti-establishment views, we look at a question which expresses distrust in the national parliament. And once again, the Sweden Democrat single out as very different from the other parties, both on the voter side and on the politician side. So based on this, our idea is to link political identification to individual traits, either of politicians or of voters. So in particular, does outsider status in society drive mobilization of the Sweden Democrats? So the thinking is very simple. If you belong to a marginalized group in society, you're more likely to identify with an anti-establishment platforms. So I'm going to show you 7 measures of economic and social outsidership, which apply both to the individual in current life and her early life status. The second aspect I'm going to look at is related to the other tenet of the party, namely anti-immigration. And here we're going to look at individual immigration exposure. So the idea that you're more likely to identify with a party that says the immigrants steal our jobs or they steal your social insurance money if you are more exposed to immigration than other people. You can think about that as being motivated by personal experience, or you can think about it as being more subject to stereotyping from that experience. And I'm going to show you, again, labor market and neighborhood immigrant exposure measures. So a few words about data. I don't have time, so let me just say that this is big data. All in all, we have socioeconomic information for about 14 million unique individuals from Sweden's different registers. Around 200,000 of those are politicians, so we don't run a small sample problem. In fact, we have the whole population. And we also have some information from individual surveys, some of which you already saw. So this is a key slide, so let me spend 2 minutes at least on it. So this shows how Sweden Democrat politicians and other party politicians aggregated compare to the population. So consider the leftmost set of bars. The translucent broad bar is the population share. And here we're talking about people who are labor market outsiders, meaning that they didn't have a stable job consistently over the last 3 years, a particular criterion. Now, the Sweden Democrat politicians, instead, about 47% are labor market outsiders in that sense. So the Sweden Democrats overrepresent labor market outsiders, whereas the other party politicians only have 20% share of labor market outsiders. So they instead severely underrepresent that group. Now the second bar refers to what we call vulnerable insiders. These are people who have a job, but they have a more unsecure job because it's more routine task-based. Again, the Sweden Democrats overrepresent this group relative to the population. The other parties severely underrepresent them. Same is true for a measure of whether you received social welfare in the past year. Now we're getting to the more social measures. Do you belong to a nuclear family or not? About 40% of the population is single or divorced. 55% of the Sweden Democrat politicians, only 25 plus of the other party politicians. Was your father an outsider 40 years ago? Again, overrepresentation among the Sweden Democrats, underrepresentation among the other parties, although not that much. Did your father go on welfare at that time? Same pattern. And did you grow up in a nuclear family, i.e. were your parents divorced by the age of 18, when you were 18? And again, we see overrepresentation among the Sweden Democrat politicians of that trait, underrepresentation of the other party politicians. The last four bars refer to the measures of immigration exposure. Are you in an industry which is more exposed to immigrant workers? Are you in an occupation that is more exposed to immigrant workers? Do you live in a neighborhood where there are lots of immigrant workers? And do you belong to a community where immigrants are overexposed among those receiving social welfare? Roughly the same picture as the outsider measures, but not as stark. Now, some of you may say, well, isn't this all capturing the same thing? Namely, those who are identify with the radical right are all low-educated, middle-aged men. Now, that turns out not to be the case, as shown in this graph, where we, for each of these 11 traits in the previous graph, first show you a black dot and the confidence interval. That's just the vertical difference between the Sweden Democrat share and the other party share in the previous graph. The next dot and confidence bar is when we control for education, age, and sex. And the third one is when we control for these variables as well as all the other 10 variables that are included in this analysis. And as you can see, the raw data differences by and large survive unscathed by controlling progressively for more things. Now, you may ask, which are the more important traits? And one way to answer that question is to let the data decide. So we use the machine learning algorithm, namely the random forest, to pick out the features which best predict that a politician is a member of the Sweden Democrats rather than another party. And I show you the bars here, which show the relative importance of these different features. And it turns out that the four most important traits are all about outsider status. So I'll go with those in the remainder. Now, the Sweden Democrats are not only overrepresented nationally, which is what I've shown you so far, they're also overrepresented locally. This graph shows you that the Sweden Democrat overrepresentation in these four traits follow the municipal composition, in the sense that if there are many labor market outsiders in a municipality, there are many Sweden Democrat politicians, and they respond more vigorously than the other parties to this variation in local population. Have to do this quickly, so let me quickly talk about the identity of the Sweden Democrat voters. So here we don't observe the individual votes, but it's natural to say that if the share is higher of outsider traits in a certain jurisdiction, then we would expect higher shares of Sweden Democrat votes. So we recorded this at the lowest level of elections where votes are recorded, and that's the precinct. That's about 1,200 voters. So we do the analysis within municipalities, and it turns out that the Sweden Democrat vote shares correlate very well with both the economic and social outsider shares at that precinct level. And if we run the multivariate regression analysis, it picks out 3 of the top 4 variables from this politician random forest I just showed you. So these 4 graphs show you at the precinct level within municipalities and within a certain election how well these 4 categories of outsidership correlate with the Sweden Democrats vote share. And one has to say that that's a pretty tight correlation in all these instances. So our interpretation of these data is that we have something we might call a citizen candidate movement, in the sense that the Sweden Democrat politicians overrepresent the same groups as their voters. I say citizen candidate because, like in the citizen candidate models, we can imagine that politicians cannot commit, and if they share the same traits with the voters, they become more credible candidates. One may ask whether this outsider status is peculiar to the Sweden Democrats. Perhaps it's peculiar to all new parties because they have to enter into politics. That turns out not to be the case, we show in the paper. We analyze other new parties that have appeared in Sweden, and for example, the Greens overrepresent insiders, people with stable jobs and safe jobs. And the Christian Democrats, surprise, surprise, overrepresent people who live in nuclear families, so family insiders. In the paper, we also argue that this way of looking upon things give traction on the particular timing of Sweden Democrat growth, and we appeal to dramatic events in the 2006 to 2014 period when the Sweden Democrats grew. This was a fiscal policy shift and the financial crisis, which widened the gaps between insiders and outsiders when it came to income and unemployment. And we show that that correlates well with what happened at the municipality level once you run shift share regressions. The final piece of analysis I'll show you is something about the valence of Sweden Democrat politicians versus other party politicians. So we asked whether Sweden Democrat politicians, how they compare to other party politicians when it comes to their experience, two measures of experience, ability, two measures of ability, public service motivation, and morality in the sense of honesty and humility. And these are mostly captured from the surveys and the registers that I alluded to before. And for all these measures of valence, the Sweden Democrat representatives score lower than other party politicians in the raw data, as well as when we hold constant the basic demographics, as well as the 11 variables that entered into the analysis. So let me wrap up. I'm out of time. I've talked about the study of populist radical right politicians and voters. The Sweden Democrats seem to overrepresent economic and social outsiders. We can see that as a citizen candidate movement. Outsider-insider gaps seem to trigger political identification with populist radical right values. And let me finish with a thought based on political philosopher Hannah Pitkin's theory of representation. So it seems that through the Sweden Democrats, politically weak groups in Sweden's society got more descriptive representation, but they did get it by politicians with lower valence. So that descriptive representation may not yield substantive representation the day when the populist radical right enters government, but that's for another seminar. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Torsten. That was excellent. We now move on to Moses Shayo, who is now reaching us all the way from Jerusalem on tribal politics. So it's over to you, Moses.
Okay. Show my screen. You see my screen?
Yes. Great, thanks.
Okay. I had some questions for Torsten, but maybe after the. So you'll see this is closely related. This is joint work with Asaf Patir and Bnaya Dreyfus. Bnaya is a graduate student at Harvard Economics, so you should pay attention to him. And Asaf Patir is a polymath. He used to be in string theory in physics, then he moved to macroeconomics. Now he's doing cryptocurrency. He's an interesting guy. I'm just a boring economics professor at Hebrew U. So what is this about? So this is so political economy models typically start with voters who have policy preferences. This could be very complicated preferences or preferences over multidimensional policies, but in the end, voters care about outcomes. What we're trying to understand here is how do economies work where voters don't have preferences? What they have is groups, and they vote for their group, not for a particular preference. This is what I said, economies where voters are mainly concerned with policy outcomes. You know, we know a lot about how these economies work. But there's a lot of evidence, starting already in the 1960s, that many voters support their party independently of issues, and people even adjust their policy preferences to match their candidates' policies and views, which means that this could affect a very wide range of policies, even in policies, not just immigration, international trade, but even things that have no clear relation to the voters' interest, like stuff about climate change. So this is trying to understand how tribal politics works. And we define tribal politics as environments where a significant share of voters, it's going to be an endogenous set of voters, stick with leaders who represent their group regardless of the leader's policies. So these are people who see politics primarily as about us versus them, where us could be my nation versus another nation, my ethnicity versus another ethnicity, my religion versus the other religion, my race against the other race. This is what politics is about. So we have an intuition that this is an important concept and that there are people like that around. But since this is not well defined, we don't really have very good empirical measures to study it. So this is going to be a theoretical paper, but the goal is empirical in the end. We want to define the concept so we can start developing empirical measures of tribal voters and tribal politics. Then we want to understand what are the conditions for the emergence or the decline of tribal politics, what characterizes tribal and non-tribal governments, what policies do they pursue, and finally the dynamics, how does policy in one period affect the likelihood of getting a tribal or non-tribal regime in the next period. Most of the predictions we're going to get are going to be new, so I don't know if it's true or not. It's not like I have a set of results that I want the model to explain. Many of the predictions still need to be tested. I'll note them in violet. But we hope this can also help tie together some of the existing evidence on populism, identity politics, and polarization and social identity. So I'll go through very briefly the basic model and the static analysis. I won't have time to do dynamics today. So here's the setup. I'll try to do it in one slide. There are two tribes, a majority and a minority. And the ratio of the minority to the majority voters is less than 1. Politicians choose a policy, as usual. But they also choose a tribal stance. What is a tribal stance? It means I proclaim that politics is all about us versus them. And I am the defender of our tribe. So you can interpret this as something that's purely rhetoric or just a narrative that explains how the world works. Everything works around us versus them. Or this could be non-economic or symbolic policies like respecting our traditions, honoring our flag, etc. Each individual has an income or a social economic status, Y. This Y induces preferences over economic policy. Within each group, this Y is distributed F sub G for group G. So it's going to be Fm, big M, and F small m. And Y hat of G is the prototypical income of group G. So it's the prototypical member of the group, say the mode or the median or the mean. At this stage, we don't say exactly what it is, but it's the prototype. It's the typical member of the group in terms of this social economic status or income. An important part is that the fact that you belong to a group is not the same. This does not imply that you identify with the group, right? I can belong to a particular religious group. I don't necessarily identify with that religion. Okay. Now we're going to make two assumptions. The first assumption, an extreme one, is the following, just to make our point very stark. So people who identify with their group, with their tribe, always vote for a tribal candidate from their group whenever one exists. So these are the people who go with their candidate regardless of policy. That's the only thing they care about. Assumption two is that regardless of whether I identify or not, I will never vote for a tribal candidate of the other tribe. So if you run on an anti-Muslim ticket, you're going to lose the Muslim vote. Okay, if you run on an anti-Semitic ticket, you're going to lose the Jewish vote. So this is basically the model, and what drives the model are two simple trade-offs. So for the politicians, if you play the identity card, well, you gain the unconditional support of people who will go with you no matter what you do, but you alienate the other tribe. For voters, the main trade-off is whether they identify with their tribe or not. And here we're relying heavily on identity economics and social identity studies in general, where basically the trade-off is the following. If you identify with a group, what you gain is you gain the pride of thinking of yourself as member of that group. So you gain the status of that group. But you pay a cognitive cost of identifying with people that are potentially different from you. So this is how we formalize it. So basically the value of identifying with a tribe G, you gain the status of the typical member of that tribe, but you lose something that depends on many things, but it also depends on how different you are. How different YI is from the typical member of the group. And then a crucial parameter here is how salient are the tribal cleavages. So if the tribal cleavage is very salient, if it's very, people pay all the attention to skin color, then this difference doesn't play much of a role. I only see your skin color, I don't see our economic differences. If the skin color is not very salient, then it's going to be harder for me to identify with people who are socially very different from me. So that's the basic trade-off on the voter side. Now let's look at the basic analysis. So instead, so there could be many, you could imagine many political games that we could analyze, but we're trying to get at a pretty general characterization of tribal politics. So instead of specifying the political process, we're going to look for a Condorcet winning triple. That is, we're looking for a candidate, a tribal stance, and a policy. So this triple that wins against any other triple. So against any other candidate with their tribal stance and an economic policy. So you can think of these candidates just like Torsten's citizen candidates that he just described. So who is this candidate who is going to win against any other policy with a tribal stance or not? And this is the first result. I'm not going to go into the formalities, but basically there is this condition here. I'll go into it in a second, but there is this condition. If this condition holds, then we have, this is the condition for tribal politics. Then there is a Condorcet winner that is tribal. Specifically, the winner is going to be from the majority group, adopt a tribal stance, and the policy is going to be what? It's going to be the median policy of the non-tribal members of the majority group. Right, so the tribal candidate, right? So if I'm a tribal candidate, the tribal voters are going to vote for me regardless. So what policy am I going to propose? I'm going to propose the policy that gets me the swing voters, who are the individualists, the one who do not identify actually with me. So you can see this will generate a policy that doesn't actually serve the interests of the guys of the base of the tribal leader. If this condition doesn't hold, then there may or may not be a Condorcet winner. So the existence of tribal candidates can destabilize the system. But if a Condorcet winner exists, then it's the standard non-tribal candidate that proposes a policy that is the ideal policy of the median voter in the population as a whole. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. So what is the condition for tribal regime? So for there to be a tribal regime, we need the share of tribal voters within the majority to be large enough to compensate for those. If I'm a tribal candidate, I'm going to lose the minority vote. So this has to be large enough relative to the number of eligible voters or actual voters from the minority. And this gives us a nice interaction between three important factors that have been emphasized a lot in the literature. One is the income distribution or socioeconomic distribution, this F. The second one is this omega. It's the salience of the ethnic or the racial cleavages in society. And the third one is more demographic or institutional, is about who can vote, how many of the minority there are and how many of them can actually vote. So let's look at these things. So first, just a preliminary point, who are the tribal voters? Well, because the rich guys, so suppose this is the distribution of the majority group. And this is the typical member of the majority group, Y hat M. Well, the rich guys or the high status guys are not going to identify. They don't gain anything from identifying with their tribe. The poor guys may, but the very poor may not, because they might be too far away from the typical member of the group, right? So this says that the set of tribal voters, so tribalism is potentially non-monotonic in income. Okay, so basically they are this lower middle class, and we do have some evidence, very little evidence. This is something that just came out, but we didn't know about this when we wrote the model. But some evidence that indeed the relation between individual economic conditions and voting for the radical right is non-monotonic. So at least in Europe, there's evidence, Europe around 2010, that the poorest of the poor actually vote for the radical left, which is in our model like their ideal economic policy, whereas the support for the radical right is those who are just above them. What we need to test is that this relationship varies systematically with shocks to omega. So if omega is 0, we're not going to have any tribal voters. If omega is very large, all the poor are going to be tribal. Okay, and there are many shocks to omega that have been studied in the literature. I'll list a few here, but the shocks to omega don't just change who the tribal voters are. Because they change who the tribal voters are, they also change whether we're going to have a tribal regime or not. So the higher, if we look at this graph again here, the higher omega, the more tribal voters there are. So variation in omega can come from cultural or historical forces that affect perceptions of intergroup differences, sometimes with the help of tribal politicians today that stir up old hatreds. We all know of examples like that, or contemporary events that change the salience of intergroup differences. The most studied ones are intergroup conflict or immigration. I'll get back to immigration in a second, but that's a big one. Second, shocks to the income distribution, right? The more people are in the lower middle class, so if you shift people from the upper middle class to the lower middle class to below this prototype, you're going to have more of a tribal base. But what this says is that the tribal politics is not just driven by the economic hardship by itself. So it's not just the fact that there's economic hardship that drives you to the radical right or to the tribal politics. It's your relative position, and it's only the people in the majority group that really matter. So you need to get tribal politics, you need a swelling of the lower ranks in the distribution of the native population. So this can show up even if the overall economy is doing well. The most important part is the interaction between the two. So adverse income shocks, so suppose you there are more people at the lower middle class. If the difference between the groups, if the cleavage between the two groups is not very salient, there's not going to be many tribal voters, even if there's a very adverse income shock. It's going to matter when omega is high, when the cleavage is already high. And there's some evidence looking at, for example, the effects of the German banking crisis on Nazi support. The effects were not uniform. So in places where anti-Semitism was already high, the effect was much stronger. The effect of the economic crisis on support for the Nazi Party. There's also data on the US, so the same economic shock, I'm not citing it here, but the same economic shock has different effects on blacks and whites in terms of what policies and what candidates they support. So it's not just the economic shock per se leading people to support certain policies, it's that it shifts their identity. And the other side of that, the shocks to salience are more consequential than when there are many people at this margin where a shock to salience would make a difference. So when there are many people at the lower ranks of the distribution, that's where a shock to salience is going to make a difference. If everybody is happy and not identifying with the group, an economic shock may not have much of an effect. A salience shock may not have much of an effect. Finally, tribal politics is more likely to emerge when the vote share of the minority is low, right? Because the political cost of running on a tribal ticket is low. And this contrasts with other models where it is actually, so ethnic politicians, so this is a model, very famous model by Gerard, Padron, and Miquel, saying, well, why do we have ethnic politicians? Because people fear that the other group will take power, and so we prefer to have our own guys in power. So here, tribal politics is more likely when the other group is very strong. In our model, it's exactly the opposite. It's when the Jews are less than 1% of the population, that's when there's little cost to run on an anti-Jewish platform. When the minority is 10% of the population, well, then there's a bigger cost. So in France, it's costly to run on an anti-Muslim platform, and maybe that's part of the reason we still don't have a tribal regime in France. We have many. One last point is that policy in a non-tribal regime is going to be the standard median voter, but in a tribal regime, as I hinted out before, the winning policy serves the median among the non-tribal voters. Okay, and this again gives us new predictions. I'll skip that. A final point is that we could have both right tribal and left tribal regimes. Maybe I'll show it graphically here on the right. So depending on the distribution, you could have, this is a non-tribal regime, the one at the top, okay, not enough tribal voters. A standard distribution would give you, if salience of the cleavage is high enough, then you get a tribal regime that is right tribal, namely the policy is going to serve the relatively rich guys, the median of the guys here on the right. But you could have situations where you have a tribal regime, you have a middle class that supports the nation, that's very nationalist, but there's so many poor people who are far away from the middle that the policy is actually going to be on the extreme left and not the extreme right. So this is what we call a left tribal regime. So to conclude, tribal politics is very closely tied to the shape of the socioeconomic distribution, especially what's happening to the middle class. However, it is not about the direct effect from economic loss to a policy that redresses this economic loss. So it's not like we've been hurt economically and now we're voting for someone who will help us economically. No, as a result of the economic shock, there's an identity shift. And therefore, the economic shock interacts with culture and demography and institutions, saying who can vote and how easy it is for the minority to vote. Like I said, many predictions still need to be tested. I'll just say one sentence about the dynamic analysis. The dynamic analysis shows how the economy can cycle between tribal and non-tribal periods. Basically, it is possible that the economic policy under a tribal regime can deplete the future set of tribal voters. I'm out of time, so I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks so much, Moses. There are a couple of questions which, if we have time, perhaps after the session, we'll take them up.
Yeah, I'll stay around.
Okay. So can I... Just give me a second. Okay, thanks very much. So now I'll be talking about the last paper is The Political Economy of Ideas. This is with Elliot Ash at Zurich and the incoming president of the IEA, Dani. So this starts with a very simple observation that most of modern political economy, essentially there's a dominant role of interests, right? So, or vested interests. So all theories of policy choice and institutional change across fields basically work off, well, you have vested interests in the form of elites, lobbies, rent-seeking groups, ethnic groups, voters, whatever, what have you, to address a variety of questions. So this approach has been fruitfully applied to ask a variety of questions. Why are some countries poor? Why do countries restrict trade? Why did elites allow universal suffrage? So on and so forth. So in a sense, the profession by and large has took up the baton from George Stigler's 1982 prize lecture, where he said the most useful way forward seemed to lie in the systematic examination of self-interest in the various participants in political life, right? So over here, so essentially a key presumption in all of this work is that political actors have stable, well-defined interests. They are fixed by their preferences, endowments, or identity. But it's worth observing that interests, our notion of interests, depend on a variety of unstated assumptions about the ideas that political actors have. So these can be that, well, what objective should they be pursuing? Are their preferences stable? Right? The notion of stable and unchanging preferences is there. Similarly, people seem to have the underlying model about how the world works. People seem to have a very clear idea of the nature of cause-effect relations. Right? But at the same time, it's worth observing that this almost exclusive emphasis on the primacy of interests is a bit puzzling, because political appeals and campaigns do not exclusively rely on naked self-interests, right? So they use narratives, emotions, appeal to values, morality. And in fact, so in order to make this point, we appeal to another tradition within, which goes back not just to Marx and Ricardo, but in the 20th century to Keynes and Hayek, who independently both suggested that ideas also matter. Where they said, in fact, very famously, Keynes said it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good and evil, right? So this is, so in this paper, we consider two kinds of ideas. So one is ideas about how the world works, and that's what we call worldview politics. And the second is ideas about who you are, and we call those that identity politics, right? So identity politics, so over here in our framework, we construct a framework where political entrepreneurs can change what identity is salient, right? So all of us have a multiplicity of identities, and we can choose, and political entrepreneurs can choose which of these identities become uppermost in our mind, which we value much more, which we conceive our interest to be associated with, right? And all of these identities can be made salient at the expense of our class, which is of course the benchmark identity. And so ideas about identity have been used in the suffragette movement, tribe or nation, as in the preceding paper, and of course, very famously in the context of identities about who a person is, so in the context of the abolitionist movement, right? So similarly, ideas can shape perception of interests, right? So very famously, we have worldviews being shaped by the introduction of the Laffer curve and a notion of what policies or what tax cuts can do for us, right? So political entrepreneurs can change public perception of how the world works, right? So this is true for austerity policies, welfare reform, and so on and so forth, right? So in this paper, what we do is we provide a minimal conceptual framework which integrates ideas with interests, where both ideas and interests are important and they feed into each other in a dynamic framework, and they both matter for policy and institutional change. Right? So there are two income groups, a high income group and a low income group. But to start off with, the incumbent and the median voter is drawn from the low income group, right? So think of a high income challenger. And if you have a high income challenger, say a Republican or whatever, the challenge which he faces is, how do you get the median voter to vote for you? So there are two possibilities. One possibility is you get him to care about something something else other than class. One possibility is income, or one possibility is identity. So that's one possibility. Or the second possibility is you persuade him by shifting his worldview. So persuade him that, well, maybe austerity is actually good for him, right? So how to push through a policy that hurts the low-income majority? As I said, there are these two possibilities. So in this paper, what we have is the political challenger, through a stochastic process of discovery, he invests in a technology, and with some probability, he discovers these memes. And memes are the concrete manifestation of ideas in the political marketplace, with some combination of, and you can consider them to be some combination of cues, narratives, symbols, information, what have you, that channelizes these ideas to voters. And exposure to these memes can either shift a voter's worldview, and similarly, exposure to an identity meme can make identity salient, such that you end up with a new political equilibrium. So in this paper, we describe parameters under which you can have either only interests ruling, in other situations when you have both worldview and identity politics playing out, and in other cases, only identity and only worldview politics. One observation which I wanted to make about our results, and I'm not discussing a series of results, is that we also observe that there's an ideational complementarity. The returns to investing in worldview politics, that is the discovery of worldview memes, are increasing in the returns to investing in identity politics, and vice versa, right? So, and in part, this arises because of something like what we call an association effect, where utility from belonging to the rich identity group is increasing in this group's relative income. So for example, low-income white voters may be willing to support a policy, say, of financial deregulation that benefits the rich white minority, if in fact financial deregulation gives them an indirect bump in utility through the association with other now very rich white beneficiaries of this policy, right? So there are other ways in this which this complementarity can arise, but I won't discuss this right now. So the question is, so we can use this framework to analyze a variety of interesting dimensions. And one aspect which we briefly explore is inequality. So inequality can be because, so what is the impact of higher inequality on ideational politics? So in our model, we show that the rich political challenger has a greater incentive to discover policy memes that persuade the lower income medium voter that, for example, austerity and low taxes are in fact good for them. And similarly, higher inequality will also rise from this association effect, which I just described, because of complementarity. So all in all, higher inequality is going to give rise to more identity politics. And we in fact go and try and test this using some suggestive evidence. So this is still ongoing work using the China shock, which is from Otto et al., who studied this, where we analyze the impact. So the China shock, which is greater exposure to trade with manufacturing trade with China, caused differential unemployment across parts of regions of the US. And so we treat that as an exogenous shock, which increased unemployment and increased wage inequality. And then try and see, well, what is the impact of this higher inequality on the nature of messages and the nature of political advertising which is taking place by both the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party across various media markets in the US. Right? So in order to do this, we put together the complete records on political advertising for the years 2000 to 2016. And what we have is the number of distinct ads aired for each party, as well as the number of times advertising in that category aired for each party. And we also know we have the precise wording of each ad, and we can classify all of these ads into 80 topics. In fact, we didn't have to do this. This was independently done by this group, which is the Wesleyan Media Project, which actually has provided us with all this data. And this is at the presidential, Senate, House, governor, and local level. We have over 60,000 distinct messages. And I mean, and then we carry out following Otto et al. We carry out a simple 2SLS analysis. And what we can show is a few things. So at a crude level, we find that ideational politics are in fact commonplace. And of course, we've clubbed together, and our clubbing over here is something which we are trying to validate independently, but that hasn't been done yet. But you'll get a sense by looking at the topics. So this is on the blue is the Democrats, the red is Republicans, and what we're comparing in this graph is comparing regions which have had a China shock and inequality has gone up with regions of the US where there has been no China shock, and trying to see, has there been a shift in the nature of advertising being done by the Republican Party, as well as a shift in the nature of advertising being done by the Democratic Party. And what we find is both parties increase political advertising on unemployment and decrease, for example, on environment and regulation. The Democrats increase they add share on taxes, on trade, on welfare, and China, while Republican ad increases are on abortion, moral values, terrorism, gun control, and Obamacare. I mean, you can see this more closely over here. So on the same graph, abortion, Democrats have decreased advertising. Well, it's not significant, but Republican definitely has increased moral values, terrorism, gun control, Obamacare. It's kind of, so Democrats have increased in taxes, there's definitely interests, or well, possibly interests. And so this is the where we are vis-a-vis this. Then at present, what we are doing is we are also trying to explore whether we see any ideational complementarity, in the sense that, yes, the China shock resulted in a shift in the nature of politics. So the Republican Party shifts to ideas. But right now, what we're trying to see is whether there's greater complementarity. And what we do seem to find is both Republicans and Democrats, in places where there's more identity political advertising taking place, that's also places where this is a pure correlation, or it should be interpreted as a correlation. You also see more worldview politics taking place. Right, but we're working on this as of now. So, all in all, what this paper does is it provides a minimal conceptual framework to integrate ideas with interests. So, in a sense, what we're doing is bringing Stigler and Becker on the one hand, and integrating insights from Keynes and Hayek. And in the process of doing that, we are showing that economic interests can drive the ideas that politicians put forward, right? So in a sense, we're not saying that interests don't matter. Of course they matter. As Shepsley famously said, ideas can be regarded as hooks on which politicians hang their objectives and further their interests. But we also show in our framework, not over here, we didn't have the time, that ideas also shape interests. So in our model, this occurs because voter preferences change ex post, because suddenly identity becomes salient or not, and or their worldviews shift. And in either case, voter preferences over policy, the rankings over policy actually shift. That's why they matter. That's why we do this, right? So the practice of ideational politics is broader than commonly thought. And we allow for a role for memes. And we show that this ideational politics at a very broad level can be classified into worldview politics and identity politics. And then we provide some preliminary evidence from the China shock to suggest that actually one of a comparative statics, at least in we have suggestive evidence in support of that. Thank you very much. And I think I'm perfectly on time. Thanks very much. Okay, so now let me unshare my, where is this? Okay, excellent. So now we have several questions, and I know it's time, so though some of you would like to jump off, that's fine, but I'm sure those of you around, I'll ask some of the questions which have been asked. So one of them is, from Dani, which is question for Torsten. If policy and financial crisis shocks widened insider-outsider gaps, driving skepticism in establishment and existing policies, Can you speculate why existing parties, particularly on the left, were not able to generate the requisite platforms to capture that discontented vote? Is it that social democrats are too much part of the establishment, so any alternative platform would not have seemed credible? Torsten.
Yes, in fact, I typed probably publicly a reply to Danny, which says that if you look at the various parties individually rather than lump them together as we have done in the stuff that I showed you, the Social Democrats are the worst in the sense of overrepresenting insiders, and in particular when it comes to the economic dimensions, they the party that has the most people with stable jobs and with safe jobs, many trade union members who have those kind of jobs. And so from the viewpoint of our approach, they just couldn't offer a credible alternative in terms of the ticket that they offered, even though they maybe the natural spinal cord reaction of a political economist. They didn't have the right credentials.
Thanks, Torsten. Next question is for Moses. So could your model help explain the political polarization in the US, even if the economic trade shocks occurred and were possibly more deeply felt in the late 2000s? In other words, can economic shocks, distributional effects that occurred in the relatively distant past interact or help shape identities today? Moses.
Yes. First point to note is that the electoral results in 2016 and 2020 were not all that different. It was very close also in 2020, so we shouldn't make too much of that. That being said, I think the salience of the racial and anti-immigrant divide was much stronger in 2016. So this was the main plank on Trump's agenda, and it was less so in 2020. And I thought Biden also did a good job in highlighting other factors, economic factors, which counteracted the white versus black or white versus Mexicans divide. So it's not so there were still a lot of people in this lower middle class who did go with Trump no matter the policy. It's not like they disappeared, but I think the climate and the Democrats managed to reduce Omega just enough so that they could win. These differences were more stark, I think, if you compare Bush and Obama, for example. Obama in 2008 was all about economics and Main Street versus Wall Street, and he won much more easily. So their Omega was very low. It was mostly about the economic issues, the economic divide, rather than the ethnic divide.
Thanks, Moses. Then there is also a question, does ideational politics also apply in a multi-party country like Indonesia? So there's no particular presumption why issue ideas about, at least the way we framed ideational politics. In fact, I would say they've been ubiquitous across space as well as across time. And that's what politicians do. I mean, whether it is multi-party or two-party system, it doesn't automatically, I don't think it would make it would of course change things on the details, but in principle, I don't see why even a multi-party country, for instance, some political groups may not choose to emphasize, for instance, identity. So I think it would definitely apply in all political contexts. In fact, even independent of democratic contexts, you can have ideational politics. Any other
Can
questions?
I ask a question?
Please,
Or
please.
other more? No, I just out of, if there are other questions, then go ahead. It's just something I missed in the
Oh,
talk.
I think we are, from what I can see, I think
We're okay. So I missed the part about Valence. Can you repeat? Can you repeat exactly what you measure with Valence? And I found it very curious that these guys are not only outsiders, but did you say that they were less competent, basically? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, so we measure, valence is very hard. It's in a model, it's just a V, but what is it in reality? And previous work has taught us that probably many dimensions are relevant. So we measure political and public sector experience because these are local politicians mostly, and that's all about managing the public sector. And they are massively less experienced than other party politicians. It's a new party, so it's partly explainable, not the public sector, but the political experience. Then we measure ability in a couple of dimensions, both higher education, tertiary education, but also, a measure we used in our QG paper about, and AR paper about, how well people in a small cell compare with other people in the small cell wage-wise. And that's a measure of how well you're doing relative to others like you, that. Yeah, and they are massively worse than the other party politicians, the Sweden Democrat politicians. Then we have survey evidence on, public motivation score that people in public administration use. And social psychologists like to measure morality by your humility. Like, would you take bribe, use counterfeit money if you could get away with it? Would you flatter your boss if you think it would give you personal advantage? Things like that. And again,
you find lower morality for these guys? Yeah,
register lower morality for the Sweden Democrat guys. That's the weakest result, but still they have lower morals. So, in a sense, hence the Pitkin reference at the end. You get these groups who are underrepresented very severely by the traditional party, get better representation by people like them. Will they get influence? Well, supposedly that has something to do with the competence and the balance of the party to translate that into substantive representation. And that's the trade-off. I'm not going to respond to that. It's a normative issue, but you can think for yourself.
No, because just because from the perspective of my model, they're not representing their group because their group follows them anyway. Your perspective is they would like to represent their group, but they're just incompetent. If they were competent, they would have been insiders.
Perhaps, yeah. And there are deeper issues about exactly how the selection process happens, but you can't study everything in one paper.
Thanks, Torsten. I note I'd missed this question, which was addressed to Moses, but it was also addressed to me. Essentially asking, do economic shocks and identity shifts, do they need to be contemporaneous or can they be sequential? I didn't have time to get into this in our empirical work, but the question is completely on point because what we found in the data, because we were looking at political advertising over the period 2000-2016, and in our case, what we found was many of the identity shocks which took place in the 2000s to 2010, they manifested themselves into, so first you had identity polarization which took place, and once identity got baked in, you had worldview politics in the sense of austerity, economics, etc., also kicked in almost in a sequential way. More broadly, you'll see, even when it comes to something like Brexit, it is entirely, arguments can be made that the the distinctive identity which England kept pushing for, distinct from the EU, or which the Tory party kept pushing for, baked things in such that it made people very susceptible to the shift in the worldview that perhaps even economically, the EU, the Britain doesn't gain from being part of the EU, right? So you're absolutely right. This doesn't have to be contemporaneous. There can be a sequential element over here too. Okay.
Can I interject on this point that, I think if you look at Brexit or Trump through the conventional lenses, it's very hard to understand the unconventional coalitions that they built. Trump, of people in West Virginia and Republican housewives in suburbs, and in the Brexit case, people who want to rule Britannia from Eton with, people hopelessly coal mining district, whatever. How can these guys ever vote for the same thing? And the answer is identity politics that's prospectively rallies these groups under the same flag, nationalism in this case, which can take different forms for people. Some people think things were better before good old Britannia or good old US, and others have a completely different conception of what it means. And that's these kind of unholy coalitions will appear in Moses' model, and maybe in your model too, which I didn't grasp. But it's an important way of thinking about those issues, I think.
I would say one more thing about dynamics. From what we know about identity dynamics, I have an intuition that identity tends to be sticky. So if you identify a certain way, you remain that way. But the empirical studies tend to show that it's extremely fluid. It's very easy to change people's identities, and the reason identities are often sticky in the real world is that the circumstances stay the same. So there's an equilibrium where the circumstances. So, example, we had we did a study of identities in India, and we saw shifts in identity as a result of salience, or as a result of status change, or as a result of prices. And the shifts, there are big shifts in identity as a result of conflict. Say if there's Hindu-Muslim conflict and Hindus become more Hindu and Muslims, but those effects die out within like 9 months, a year. Changes that come about because of changing in relative prices, those effects stick for a very long time, but they stick because it seems to be the case because prices are, changes in prices tend to stick. And therefore, people remain in their new identity for a long time. Similarly, changes in wages, which feed into changes in status. But that's empirically a very interesting question. How sticky is identity?
I think political scientists like Andy Gelman has studied this, and other people too. Sort of cohort effects in politics, when the notion is that you take a stand when in your formative age, when you have to vote for the first time, and that stance you take tends to be very sticky, and they show empirically that depending on the issues that surround a particular US election, or that surround a particular US president, you see these cohort effects for election after election. And social psychologists hold the convenient view that people tend to make up their mind once and for all. And then it's predetermined. And the only change is generational change, basically. But that's a bit too simple, I think.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. Even Paula Giuliano and Spilimbergo had some work on the impressionable years hypothesis, which is pointing towards how, so that's on one dimension. And then on the other dimension, a very different context, not vis-a-vis voting, but Ulrike Malmendier has work on how, if you grew up during the Great Depression, it has persistent effects on your attitudes towards how much you should how much you should invest in the stock market and so on. So I think it.
I know that, but the question is whether this is so. There are persistent effects, but whether new shocks can shift you in the opposite direction. So it's a discussion I had with David Layton from Stanford, who's one of the, I think, the best scholars on identity. And I was arguing for the sticky viewpoint, and he says these things can change very easily if the shock is important enough, is large enough.
And the point is, there's going to be heterogeneity, but all that is relevant in an operational sense in politics is whether things shift for the median voter, and even if they don't change for the bulk, it doesn't matter, so long as, that's an interesting observation. Anyway, thanks a lot, Torsten. Thank you very much, Moses. That was extremely interesting. And thank you to all the attendees for being patient and staying 20 minutes past the time. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hope to be able to visit Indonesia at some point physically.
No, I still have a ticket which is uncollected.
To Bali.
For Bali, yeah. Now what do you do? But anyway, thanks everybody, and thanks to the organizers. Bye, guys.
Bye.